should we begin?
Yeah, but
Yeah, definitely.
the request we have to keep silence for few seconds.
For a minute, I guess. So
Yes.
should we just pay our homage to Dr. Parchure and Dr. Ramesh Parthasarthi's son, two demises that happened suddenly. So we'll maintain a minute of silence and then begin our program.
Kamlesh, Kamlesh, please mute everybody.
May I request everybody else to please mute yourselves except me and Mark? Mark, please unmute yourself. Unmute. Mark, please unmute yourself. Unmute. Yeah, okay. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many people this Sunday to hear Mr. Mark Lee, our speaker today. Most of you know Mark, so I'll just give a brief introduction. Mark Lee grew up in California, USA, and he met Krishna Ji for the first time in Saanen, Switzerland in 1965. And on Krishna Ji's request, he joined the Rishi Valley School as a teacher of English. He was founding director of Oak Grove School and later served as executive director of Krishnamurti Foundation of America for 2 decades and director of Krishnamurti Publications for 5 years. He was the chief editor of the 17 volumes of the collected works of Krishna Ji, the Book of Life and the Little Book on Living. He was the owner and publisher of Edwin House Publishing, which is specialized in memoirs of Krishna Ji's associates who had written about him. Mark has written 2 books in the last 5 years. The first one is a kind of memoir and his autobiography, Knocking on the Open Door. And his latest book, which came out just a year ago, is The Word Teacher, which is on the life of Krishna Ji for younger people. He is a trustee of Krishnamurti Foundation of America and Krishnamurti Foundation India. He lives with his family in Ojai, California. I can go on saying lots of things about Mark, but I think I'll close here. And Mark, we are going to talk to Mark basically about his experiences on working with Krishna Ji and the educational institutions he founded, basically Rishi Valley and the Oak Grove School. So I will ask a few questions and then Mark can cover whatever he wants to say on that. So Mark, my first question is, we would like you to tell us, when did you first heard about Krishna Ji and when did you meet him and what impact he had on you when you saw him?
Thank you, Vijay. It's good to be with you all. I wish we were closer. I wish we could be together, but this is, I suppose, the next best way to be able to communicate. Your question of when I first became aware of Krishnamurti takes me back to my adolescence. I was living in Santa Barbara as a teenager, and Ojai is not too far from Santa Barbara. And I met some people who had known Krishnamurti personally, and I was given a book, The Education and the Significance of Life. And I was 15 years old myself, so I hadn't read any serious literature except what I had in school. And when I started reading that book, Education, the Significance of Life, I found it extremely difficult. But I couldn't stop reading it. I put it down and I kept coming back to it over and over again. And if you'll recall, the 50s, in the mid-50s, it was the McCarthy scare in America when everyone was fearful of communists. And my mother, bless her soul, she found that I was reading this book by this author who she couldn't even pronounce. And she said to me, she said, "This may be communist literature. I don't want you to read it." But then, instead of taking away the book, she gave it back to me. And that was enough. That's all I needed to keep going. I found that it wasn't communist, and I kept reading it to the very end. So that's how I became introduced to Krishnamurti, through the subject of education and that particular book. And it really had a profound impact on me, because when I went on after high school, I thought to myself that I wanted to be a teacher. And what I read in K on the subject of education was so completely different from what established educators in America were publishing and talking about, and certainly what teacher education required in this country. So I found it extremely difficult to become a teacher, because by then my whole view of education was deeply colored by Krishnamurti, and he was almost completely unknown in academia. So I was on my own. In fact, it was I was so opposite what they were teaching young educators to do, that my advisor said, "I suggest you drop education and go into something else. And if I have anything to do with it, I will see that you never become a teacher." Because my views were so radical and so different from the established norms in university. So after I finished university, I did have an opportunity to meet Krishnamurti, because in those days he wasn't coming to California. So I heard that he was in Switzerland, and I went off to Switzerland, and this would have been in 1965. And I got a job in a school in Switzerland, and I went to hear his talks in Saanen, which were annually given in a big circus tent by the Saanen River in the Rishi Valley. And I had a chance to meet him there. And that's another whole story, how I met him. But those were my first exposures. And I remember thinking when I saw Kay for the first time, sitting in the tent, and he walked in and sat down in a little wooden chair on a platform. I remember thinking, it's the most mature man I have ever seen. My first impression was of his seriousness, his maturity, and this, of course, was borne out when he gave his talks. And I listened with great attention. So those were the first exposures to Kay that I had.
Okay, Mark, I'll go to my next question. How did you join Rishi Valley School, and what was your experience of working in India? Because you were a teacher in Switzerland and US, and how was this experience?
Well, it was Kay who sent me to Rishi Valley. As I said, I was at the talks in Switzerland, and I had a week of interviews with him, and each day after lunch, he and I would adjourn to his room, and he would grill me. He asked me questions. He wanted to know about my parents, about my education, what books I read. He asked me one of those days, he said, "Sir, are you a theosophist?" And I could tell him, no, I was not a theosophist, but I had been to Ojai and I had met a couple of theosophists. So each day we would go through this process of him asking me questions. And on the last day, which would have been the Friday, he asked me to stand at the end of his bed against the wall, and he walked to the other end of the room, and he looked at me absolutely silently, up and down, didn't say anything. Took several minutes, and then afterwards, we went out, went into the living room, and he said, "Sir," he said, "you know, we need English teachers in India. We need, in Rishi Valley School, we need English teachers. Would you be interested in going to Rishi Valley?" And by then I had become accustomed to saying yes to everything he said, every question he asked. And I said, "Yes, sir, I would be very interested." I had read something of Rishi Valley School, and I had met the Moorheads, Hilda and Harry Moorhead, who were residents of the Rishi Valley School. And so I said, yes, I would love to go. So he said, "You know, sir," he said, "Americans don't do well in India." And I looked quizzical. He said, "You know, sir, they get into drugs and pornography," and he said, they don't do well. So he said, "Why don't you go to India for 6 months and see if you like it? And if not, then you can leave." So I said, yes, I'd be happy to do that. So I flew off after a few days with the Moorheads, went to Mumbai from Geneva, and eventually got to Bangalore, and then the three of us drove to Rishi Valley. And that was really the beginning of a completely new life for me, because I fell in love with India, I fell in love with Rishi Valley, I fell in love with Indians deeply, profoundly. And instead of staying 6 months, I stayed 8 years. And what I found when I was in the school was, it was true. There was a fairly low level of English instruction. The textbooks were British, and there were no books in the in the elementary school library, and the classrooms were primitive. So I took it upon myself to spend the first 2 years just bringing up the standard of English instruction. And when Kay would come each year, I'd have the chance to meet with him, go for walks with him, have lunch with him. And he was always very affectionate with me. He always, every year he inquired if I was comfortable, was I healthy, was I lonely? He was concerned about how I was adapting to life in India. He said, "Sir, do you have a carpet on your floor?" And so we grew closer, and of course, our relationship was completely involved in education, issues of education. He never wanted to talk about the students. When I had an interview or went for a walk with him, it wasn't students he was interested in. He was interested in how I was teaching, what I was teaching, and the state of my own mind, how I perceived my responsibilities as a teacher. Those were the issues we talked about.
Thank you, Mark. Would you like to tell us any unique or worth mentioning experience that you had in Rishi Valley with Krishna Ji or in any other way? And why did you leave Rishi Valley after 8 years?
Yes, there were so many experiences. After 5 years, of course, I met my wife, my wonderful Asha, and we were married, and that seemed to cement the whole prospect that I would live indefinitely in Rishi Valley in India, and I fully expected to do that. I had many walks with Kay and meals with him and opportunities to discuss things. There was one walk that was very mysterious, and I only tell it because there emerged after a few years, in my mind, there was a whole aura around Kay that was completely unexplainable. It was completely beyond reason. It was something which I couldn't completely understand. There were mysteries. One day I taught swimming, and in those days, Rishi Valley had a swimming pool near the junior school, and I had been giving a swimming class there, and the end of the class, the children left, and I got out of my swimming suit and got dressed and walked out to the road. And just as I got to the road, Krishna Ji was walking down the road towards the entrance to the school, and he saw me. And he stopped and he looked at me and he said, "Sir," he said, "you look like a Mahatma." And I didn't know what he meant. And so he said, would you like to walk? So I joined him and we walked briskly out towards the entrance along the road. And I said, why did you call me a Mahatma, sir? And he said, look, sir, you're dressed in blue. And it was true. I had on a blue kurta, which was a beautiful shade of royal blue. It was khadi, and I was wearing white chudidars, North Indian style. And the blue kurta was one that I'd had made in Delhi because my father-in-law, who was on the Khadi board in Delhi, had recently assigned that blue Khadi cloth for all railway workers. And I thought it was a nice piece of cloth, so I took some and had a kurta made, and I was wearing it. And Krishna Ji said, sir, he said, do you know that color is God? And that startled me. We kept walking. And as we walked along the road towards the mouth of the valley, Krishnaji said some strange things. At one crossroad, he said, sir, don't go on that road. He said, evil lives on that road. I was struck by what he said, but I didn't have the nerve to ask him what he meant. And we walked some more. And he said, sir, this land is sacred. Do you feel it, sir? Do you feel it? This land is sacred. And I said, sir, you mean the valley? He didn't say anything. I said, the valley is special. I said, sir, what is sacred? What does it mean to be sacred? He said, where few men have been. Well, that made sense, but it didn't seem a full description of sacred. I mean, there are many places on the earth where man has not been, and by his definition, all those places would be sacred. As we walked back again, he pointed out the small road that went off, and he said, sir, stay off that road. Stay off that road. So I only tell this story because it pointed to some things that Cade normally didn't talk about. First, his ecstatic declaration that color was God. I thought it was quite beautiful. And then the other statements, mysterious. And then over the years, I found there was more and more mystery around Kay. And I could tell more stories about that, but I'll wait and see if you ask me. The second part of your question of why I left Rishi Valley, Asha and I were married in 1969. And in 70, we had a pair of twins, Gayatri and Gitanjali. And absolutely beautiful, stunning girls. And we had a family, complete family. Unfortunately, the girls at the age of 6 months became seriously ill from mosquito bites. We happened to take a trip in the south, and we went to an area where there was an epidemic of viral encephalitis. And both girls developed high fevers, convulsions, and the virus really destroyed their brains. When Krishna Ji came that year, he tried very hard to help them. But he said they were too badly damaged, so he couldn't help them, even though he tried. And we decided that we couldn't stay on. We had to find some place in the world where we could get some treatment for the twins. So we inquired around the world and found a place in California where they offered special treatment for brain damaged children. And it was once that was confirmed that we left Rishi Valley and flew off to California. It was wrenching to leave the school because by then Asha had become the school doctor. She followed in the footsteps of Dr. Parchuri, and she had also founded a village clinic, and I was the head of the principal of the junior school. So, although we didn't want to leave, we were forced to. Just before we left, Kay had said that once we'd finished with the treatment, he asked if I would come back to help him start a school in Bangalore. And I said yes, that would be wonderful. I'd be happy to do that. But once we left and came to California, it became clear that we couldn't return to India. So I informed Kay, and he went ahead with Dr. Balasundram and Anantaswamy and others to start the Valley School in Bangalore. So that's a short version of the story of why we left India.
Thank you, Mark. In your book, Knocking at the Open Door, you mention at one point that Dr. Bala Sundaram, who was the principal of Rishi Valley School, took you once to a Tamil astrologer. Will you narrate that experience of talking to this astrologer, and did you ever mention about what he said to Krishna Ji?
Yes, Balu took me to meet Gangadhara Shastri, who was a very well-known astrologer in the South. He was the astrologer for the Maharaja of Mysore, and he was staying in a small house in Bangalore. And so Balasundram and I went there. It was a very sweet, not elderly, he was probably in his 50s, and very unassuming, simple, quiet man. And he looked at my hands, my palms, He looked at my face and he asked me my birth date. And then he started to speak. He spoke in Tamil, of course. So Balasundram had to translate for me. And if I had a question, then he translated my question to Mr. Shastri in Tamil. But he was the most amazing astrologer. I mean, I didn't know anything about astrology. I was absolutely ignorant of everything about astrology. So this was my first exposure to it. But it was overwhelming because Mr. Shastri said some remarkable things. He said, among other things, he said that my father had died and he gave the date. And he said, you came to India, and he gave the correct date. And then he said, you will become, you will get married, and you will marry a foreign woman. And which is, of course, true. And then he said, you will leave India. And he gave the date. And he said, you will become the head of an educational institution. And he gave the date, 1975. And then he said, and you will leave that institution. And he said, 1985. Well, all of this was completely accurate. Every date he gave was correct. And he spoke other things that I eventually wrote down in my diary when I returned home. Well, I was so completely struck by this man's amazing ability. He definitely had a siddhi. And years later, I told Krishna Ji about this experience I had. And Krishna Ji he listened. I told him how amazed I was by all of his predictions, the accuracy of what he said. Kay asked me a few questions about the man himself. And so he said, sir, it's interesting. But he said, beware, be careful, don't believe in it. So that was my first exposure to astrology. And I had other first experiences in some of the great arts of India. And each time I would ask Kay the significance of them, or the importance of them. And he always had a word of caution. But it was quite an amazing first exposure.
Thank you, Mark. You were very close to Krishna Ji. Would you tell us something about the process he went through in 1922 under the pepper tree and again much later in Ooty? Do you believe that these processes developed his Kundalini, as the traditional religious people would say?
Well, this so-called process is something that has fascinated me for years and years. In fact, just this year, I finished a book. This is the cover of the American edition, Krishnamurti's Process. This is coming out in India by Hay House, should be in the next month. I wrote this book. It took me almost 30 years to do it. And it's a collection of all of the first-hand eyewitness accounts of Krishnamurti's process. And I had my own experience with K, with this subject, which I include in the book. The process, apparently, and I'm no authority on it, I just have studied it and I'm interested in it, but I certainly don't know everything about it, because the process, as Kay's brother called it, was something in a way unique to Kay. It did not seem to be a traditional or classic Kundalini experience. In the early days, in 22, 23, 24, Kay experienced Kundalini-like or similar experiences where he had great pain, he became sick, he cried, he wept, he suffered. He suffered physically, emotionally. He was confused. He had visions. And at one point, he actually went outside the cottage where he was in Ojai, and he sat under the pepper tree. And I have a picture in the book of Kay sitting under the pepper tree, taken in 1922. There's only one picture known of that. And it continued for those 3 years, off and on, lasting weeks, months at a time, intermittent. And he had visions. The visions, in some ways, could be explained. Kay himself explained that if someone is steeped in a tradition, that it can affect the brain, and one can have visions. And that would explain Christians having visions of Christ, Buddhists visions of Buddha, Hindus of Indian gods, etc. But then, over the decades, the process seemed to morph and change. And Kay apparently had a connection with some profound energy, some force outside him, beyond him, that affected him physically. There are instances that I recounted in the book of him, his whole face changing, a different face. It wasn't the usual face of Krishnamurti, of a voice speaking through his body, and so on and so on. So this continued to happen really to the end of his life. And I recount an experience I had with him in Pine Cottage in the 70s. There is really no foolproof explanation for it. He discounted Kundalini and said that it wasn't traditional Kundalini. But there are no traditions, there's no other source authority that one can reference that gives a clear explanation of what it all is. Simply, it seems to be Kay's, in his words, it was some type of energy that was cleansing his brain, removing the dross from his brain. That's one thing he said about it. But it's hard to fully know it, and it's another of the great mysteries around Krishnamurti that we will probably never know, have a definitive answer. And it was right to the very end of his life.
Thank you, Mark. Would you tell us how was the idea to start a school in US? How did it come about, and did you face any difficulties in starting a school in Ojai?
Starting the school in Ojai was solely Krishnamurti's inspiration. You know, there had been a school here that was started in the late 40s. And it wasn't a Krishnamurti school. He withdrew from it and severed his association in the 50s. No, it could have been even as late as the early 60s that he stopped being associated with it. But the earliest note that we have of him saying that he wanted a school in Ojai was 1973. And that was when the lawsuits with Rajagopal were at their height. And Kay talked to the trustees, the American Foundation, and he said that he wanted to start a school. The American trustees were alarmed. They were completely tied into the court cases with Rajagopal. They had no money, and whatever money they were able to raise was spent on attorney's fees to try to rescue Krishnamurti's property and his archives. And so the idea of a school was completely foreign to the trustees. And they tried to persuade him not to start a school. Well, when Kay got an idea, when he wanted to do something, you couldn't deter him. You could reason with him, you could discuss it, you could explore it, you could go into it, but if it was something he was determined to do, he saw it through. So in 1973, when I told Kay that Asha and I would not return to India, would not be available to go to Bangalore, he said, "Good, sir." He said, "Then come to Ojai. I want to start a school in Ojai." Well, that's all it took. But it was the three of us. The trustees were not happy. They did not cooperate. They were not at all interested in starting a new adventure, and particularly one that would require money. So I proceeded to have meetings in 74 and the beginning of 75 with Krishna Ji when he came to America each winter and spring. Met him in Malibu, met him in Ojai, and we talked for days and weeks and months about the founding of a school. And the challenges were enormous. The challenges were, first, is it feasible to start a new school when you have no money, you have no property, you have no teachers, you have no students, you have nothing but an inspired idea? And Krishna Ji showed me with these many discussions that this point was the most important point in starting something. That once the school was up and running, that would be the easy part. The hard part was to be absolutely clear as to what it meant to educate, what it meant to be responsible for the lives of children. So we went into these, what is learning? What is teaching? What does it mean to lead a serious life? Is it possible to start something that is not institutional? He said, sir, don't begin another educational institution. It will succeed and then it'll fail. And so on and so on. So his whole approach was very different from what you would expect if you were starting a business or if you were starting some new agency. Because the founding premise, the founding principle was so completely different from all established norms. And he said to me, reinvent education, sir. Reinvent it from its very core. So that's how we began. In time, the first lawsuit was settled and we had land. We started to raise money and now we're getting into another story.
Thank you, Mark. My next question is related to what you have mentioned. Would you tell us the reason why there were differences between Krishna Ji and Rajgopal?
Ah, yes. There was a history that has to be understood to really put the Rajagopal K saga in perspective. And someday it'll be written up accurately. Some of the stories that have been written so far are exaggerated and not correct, including the Sloth's book. The beginnings really were, can be traced back to Annie Besant, because Annie Besant and Leadbeater chose young men to be disciples of the world teacher. And these young men were to be trained in the leading religious lives. And Leadbeater selected one by the name of Desikachar Rajagopal, a South Indian boy. And this boy was under the direction of Leadbeater. And as the years went by, there were more and more young men who were brought in. They were being trained. And concurrent with this, of course, Krishnamurti was emerging more and more as the vehicle for the world teacher. And at some point, Annie Besant wanted Krishnamurti to have some help, some people who could be relied upon to look after him, to take care of him, to travel with him, to do things with him. And she asked Rajagopal to be one of those helpers for Krishnamurti. There was a parent friendship that developed between the two young men, and they did things together. They dressed similarly, they traveled together, they ate together. Rajagopal was very bright. He was trained as an attorney, so he was well educated. And there developed a relationship. Well, to make a long story short, because their association covered more than 60 years, Rajagopal was a very ambitious man, and he became more and more irreplaceable in the work around Krishnamurti. And he worked hard to do what Annie Besant had asked him to do. She had said that they should never separate, they should never quarrel, they should always work together. And Rajagopal began to take advantage of his position as Krishnamurti's secretary, his organizer, his associate. Eventually, Rajagopal moved the headquarters from Europe, from Holland, to Ojai, California, because the Theosophical Society selected Ojai to be the seat of Krishnamurti's work. So this was a natural place for Rajagopal to bring the order of the Star Publishing Trust. And in 1933, that was started here in Ojai. But from about the year 26, according to Kay's own description, from about 26 on, the relationship between Kay and Rajagopal began to show tension, stress, strain. Rajagopal took on more and more responsibility, assumed more and more authority, and slowly, carefully pushed Krishnamurti out of his own organization. The story of the deterioration is a tragic story because it was two men who fell out with each other, although to his very last days, Krishna Ji always hoped that Rajagopal would change. In fact, 2 days before he died, Krishnamurti asked me, "Sir, has he called?" He was referring to Rajagopal. He was wondering if Rajagopal had telephoned to inquire as to Kay's health. And I said, no, he had not called. And the records will show that all through the court cases, Kay went along with the process of legal recovery of the assets the property and the archives, manuscripts, and so on. But Kay never really wanted to go to court. He never really 100% wanted to take strong legal action to destroy Raja Gopal. The trustees often had to prevent him from saying this in court when giving depositions, because Kay had this small vestige of some friendship with Raja Gopal. It was never reciprocated. Raja Gopal was, in the last 30 years, angry, vindictive, upset, and took his vengeance in any way he could find. So it's a great tragic human story, and it did not end well, because there was no reconciliation.
Thank you, Mark. Krishna Ji has often mentioned in his talks, and quite emphatically, that no organization can take one to truth. And this has to be done by an individual. And that was the reason perhaps why he dissolved the Order of the Star in the East. And yet he created a number of organizations behind him to carry out the work of dissemination of his teachings. Do you see any dichotomy in this?
I don't see any conflict. I don't see anything that suggests that Krishnamurti compromised. The organizations that Kay founded after 1929 were not spiritual organizations. They were business organizations. The Star Publishing Trust, headquartered in Ojai, was an organization to publish, disseminate the teachings, to hold the titles to the properties that were bought or given to Krishnamurti for his work. There was no spiritual aspect, no religious dimension to the work of the organizations that he started. There was a famous memo that Krishna Ji and Raja Gopal issued in 1933. We have it in the archives. In that memo, which is in some ways a kind of statement of intention of the work of the organization, was that people who are interested in the teachings should not put down roots in the organization. They should come for short periods of time. In fact, they mentioned 2 weeks in the memo. The time that a person interested in the teachings was like a revolving door. They would come in, they would be exposed to the teachings and be a part of it, learn, explore, dialogue, discuss, have exposure, and then eventually leave. So it's clear from real evidence that Kay's intention was simply to facilitate the organizational side of his work. There was no spiritual dimension. And of course, this is the case today. If you look at the foundations, the 5 foundations around the world. They manage the assets, they publish the teachings, they disseminate the teachings. They are legal entities that hold the assets. Those assets are protected with limited liability corporations, depending on the legal structure in each country. So there is no spiritual or religious dimension to the organizations that he founded after 1929.
Okay, Mark. Professor Krishna, in his book, Jewel on a Silver Platter, has mentioned your name, saying that you had met Krishna Ji just before his death, when he said, "I am ready to go. They are waiting for me." But the body had its own program, unquote. Who were they waiting for him? Would you say something about this?
Veggie, you were pointing again to one of the mysteries. There are many references where Kay talked about they. I'm speechless because it's hard to know how to describe or how to assign an identity to something as vague as this. And Kay was purposely vague because whatever these entities were that he was referencing were not, it seems to me, and this is my understanding, were not identifiable people, were not entities that you could give a name to. There was some power, some force, some energy, something that was accessible to Kay, were connected to Kay, that he was unwilling to describe. He was unwilling to identify. I remember once he told my daughter, Nandini, he said, she was very small, she was young, and he said, "Go and take a walk in the hills. They will protect you." Well, no one had the temerity to ask who he was referring to.
I'm going to ask another. Okay, I'm going to ask another question, which is perhaps mystical. You know, Krishna was operated for a benign prostatic enlargement in 1977, and he stayed overnight in a hospital. Next morning, when he got up, he dictated a note to Mary's embolist, which was basically an account of what had occurred. And he said, under quote, "When the pain arrived and became more severe, he felt his body floating in the air. Though he acknowledged that the feeling may be illusory. A few minutes later, he sensed the presence of what he called the personification of death. At that point, there seemed to occur a dialogue of sorts between his body and death. Death seemed to be talking to his body insistently, but his body refused to yield to death's demand. The body was tempted to yield, but it realized that it was not responsible for itself. It understood that another entity was involved, one that was even stronger than death. In order to protect the body, this other entity intervened, and the conversation was among the body, this other, and the death. One felt very strongly and clearly that if the other had not interfered, death would have won, unquote. How do you see this statement made by K?
Well, my friend, it's as mysterious to me as it is to you. This is the account in Mary Lutchen's book is the only one that I'm aware of where Kay talks about having a conversation or a dialogue with death. Death seemed to be something that he saw or was at hand on several occasions. There was in the 20s, there was a wall that was built in front of Pine Cottage. It's gone now. There's a picture of it in my last book. And Kay said to a friend that death and evil lived on the other side of that wall. Now, when these statements were made, when he raised these things, no one had the nerve to ask him what he meant or what he was talking about. These were such profound statements that the conversation ended. So I cannot even hazard a guess or a comment on the deeper meaning of this, other than it was what he said. Some direct contact with some great force. You know, he once said that good and evil can never come together. He said that they are in parallel streams, that evil can affect goodness, but goodness has no effect over evil. He made this as a public statement, and yet no one queried him further. No one explored it further. So we are left with the mystery.
Thank you, Mark. I come to my last question now because I want others also to ask a few things to you. Many of us were shocked to read Radha Schloss's biography of K, especially to learn that Krishna Ji had an affair with her mother. And this book, as you know, was written after Krishna Ji's death. Were you also surprised to read this or learn about it?
Well, you know, Krishna Ji died in 1986. The Schloss book was published in 1991. We knew about the book before Krishna Ji died. We had no details, no knowledge of the contents, but the author was clever, legally adroit in keeping the book under wraps until Cade passed away, because you can't libel the dead, and there would be no way to refute. When I learned about Krishnamurti's relationship, I had earlier knowledge of it through a friend of Kay's, a man by the name of Bill Quinn. And Kay had told several of the trustees, that Roger Gopal may use his relationship with Rosalind as a cudgel in the court cases to threaten Kay that he would make it public. So I didn't know any details. I didn't know the extent of it until I read the book, but I was aware of the fact that there had been a relationship earlier. I was not shocked because Kay was a human being. He fell in and out of love. He had some good relations and some poor relationships. So the possibility of him having a physical relationship was not a shock. When I finally read the book, I was shocked with the detail. And we know from Mary Lutchins and others who were closer to Kay that much of the detail in the Sloss book is highly exaggerated. So, but the interesting thing was to look at the reaction, the public reaction to the book once it came out. In '91, when it was released, we were, of course, besieged by inquiries from the general public. People telephoned, people knocked on our front doors, people sent letters, telegrams, asking, is it true? Is it true, this, that, and the other? The majority of the public reaction was, and we have preserved in the archives all of those written inquiries. The majority of the reactions were, well, Krishnamurti was a human being. I'm more interested in his teachings than in gossip and scandal. So people wanted to know if it was true. If it was true, yes. But they went on with their study, their exploration, their interest in the teachings, not in the scandal. And that says a lot to me about the public's acceptance of Krishnamurti.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you. May I request Dr. Gajanan Rao to say something or make some observation or ask something to Mark? Dr. Rao, please. Please, sir, unmute yourself. Unmute. Yeah.
I haven't any particular question regarding Krishna Ji and the relationship with Mark and vice versa. In fact, Mark has been, I think, a bit touched as well as embarrassed about questions that you'd already asked. He had a beautiful relationship with him, prolonged, very near. I really am so happy that Mark is about there, I hope. He's blessed with long, very long life to be able to firsthand clear so many doubts about Krishnamurti. I have another slightly a question which when he was been so humble in his introduction about the world teacher, only 2 quotations of Krishnamurti, first page and second, third page. I see humility is really showing, simplicity simply showing, Marx. Well, as he is living and he is with us, probably I'm more raised than him, I would like to say that happy is this man in spite of all that he went through, and is able to really have so many friends in the world to personally narrate when asked, when forced. I want to ask this. Isn't there any authority that Krishna Ji exhibited in his lifetime about the facts he had gathered about religion and the sacred? And in a way, not willing, not wishing, not wanting, become an authority when he spoke. And I stumbled and crushed under that authority. I couldn't question him. He asked questions, sir. But as he said, we couldn't question some things. He said that path is evil, don't. There's little authority there. Question is also an authoritative statement. Don't believe this. Well, in a way, there's a little paradox here. When there was a discussion between him, dialogue between him and the Benares Panditji, I forget his name, BHU, authority on Hinduism, what name, sir? Dwivedi, sir?
Jagannath Upadhyaya.
Upadhyaya, yeah. When he objected to Krishna saying that there is the other, there is the supreme, and step by step you took us to that. But you never showed us the supreme. Then why talk about it? It's like deceiving us. Oh, we know all with you. You said so many things which sort of took us near that, but there you drop us. You don't really show, but they don't talk about it. Don't go on talking about it. You know, but we don't know, but you are not able to give it to us. I was physically present around that discussion. I'm not one of those participants, but very few of us were sitting around. And Krishna Ji said, sir, I am your friend. Say even the Buddha. Because you're the Buddhist, you were trying to play that. And he took his mic and walked to him across the floor where he sat. And he said, look at the tree. The outside was a tree. Where there was a cloud, there is rain, and the tree, my God, when you say, look at the tree, it looks magnificent. Even now my hair stands. It has come into that intelligence, way of intelligence. Beautiful blackish green tree shining in that sunlight which came again after the rain. I mean, that was an incident. And he said, that tree, you tree above the ground. But then I have seen the root. I'm trying to tell you there is also the root which you don't see. That makes it the whole. So what's wrong, your friend telling you what he had seen and is sharing the experience with you? It is not authoritatively or whatever. So such things there I felt, maybe that is true. Somebody who has seen is telling you, why would it? Will it stop my search? Or it may accelerate me on that path, I don't know. So I couldn't really understand that no authority in learning. Could you really say it is really, it may be true, a statement, but I can't understand it. There are several times I had been to authority of K, of some other religious books, which, in the sense that I just followed, because I trust a man, and he's telling me something over years. And I may not want experiment, I may want to, it's another matter. There is authority in his voice, the way he puts it, the way he says it, the way he makes you experience something. So should authority be wiped out as if such an evil thing is my question? Or given some credence to be used for my own?
Yes.
Yes.
Shall I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Yes,
Go
please,
ahead.
sir.
Yes. raise a very good point. There was an intrinsic authority in K. His very presence, his silent presence was authoritative. He said once in a lunch table conversation here in Ojai, when he was telling us about the Lord Maitreya and the hierarchy in Shambhala. And at the end of the description of the hierarchy, one of the trustees said, "Sir, can you tell us about the Maitreya?" And Kay said, "You can't ask that question.
See,
You cannot ask that question." So there were apparently things that Kay was not allowed, whether he was preventing himself or whether there was some outside authority that was preventing him from speaking about, giving details, going into, describing. He couldn't, he wouldn't, he didn't. He talked around profound issues. And he once said to me, he said, "Sir," he said, don't describe or point things out to children. Make them sensitive so they discover them for themselves." And I think in a way it's what he was attempting to do with his listeners, his readers, was attempting to help people to be sensitive, to discover the sacred or what is profound or what is esoteric for themselves, rather than being told. Is that possible?
mm, yeah, sounds reasonable thought. To discover for themselves rather than hear it from somebody and take it as truth. Is what you're
Correct.
saying?
Because if I tell you the truth,
Yeah.
everything stops. You don't go any further. You just
Yeah.
hear that it's
It's true.
the
True
truth
in a
I've
way.
told you, but you haven't just seen anything.
Yeah.
You haven't discovered it yourself.
Yeah.
We have some more comments coming in. Deepika first, then Prakash Maheshwari, then Harish Ji. Deepika, please go ahead.
My question is very short. I worked in a K school for 4 years, and I've been reading K for about 8 years now. I started with my teaching experience, but I've come to a conclusion I just want to clarify, is that in K's experience, what he wants from us is to live in the moment and to take each moment as an individual moment, to observe a situation, not to take a decision straight away, and take each experience as an individual experience and then act accordingly. Am I right in making this conclusion? That's all.
Thank you, Deepika. Can Prakash Ji please unmute yourself? Prakash Maheshwari. Please unmute. You've not unmuted yourself. Harish Ji, can you unmute yourself?
No question.
Yeah. Okay, Prakash Ji, go ahead. Then Harish Ji. Prakash Ji has problem unmuting, so Harish Ji, would please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dubeyji. Very humbly, I would like to say something to what Gajanan Rao said about authority. You are not obliged to agree with me. I remember at Vasant Vihar, it was 1981-82, I'm not sure, or maybe even 83, because my first two translations of, Freedom from the Known and Meditations came out in 82. Somebody asked Krishna Ji, you talk about compassion, love, but look at yourself. You live in a style. Why? I mean, why do you do that? Why don't you do something about the poor, the underprivileged? And he said, sir, first of all, I don't have the illusion about changing every poor man's lives on earth, and injustice and this and that. The bigger fishes will continue to eat the smaller fishes. Can you stop it? And second thing, which is more important to me, and I cannot forget it, and if someday I also have the audacity to write my own account of my first and last encounter with Krishna Ji, I would describe it, and that is, he said, sir, like a good dancer, I have my own style. I walk in a style, I speak in a style. Every gesture of mine is a style. From the Indian perspective, I can even say some of the gestures which Krishnaji included in the gamut of style, I would call them mudras. And again, that's a different field, mystical field. So, Gajanan Rao, sir, he, as he said, Achyut Patwardhan in one of the dialogues, sir, when I say find out who you are, and you are asking me, no, Krishnaji, tell us who you are. Sir, I am nothing. And it is from that nothingness that I speak, I act, I do everything. And when Sunandaji questioned, or Pupalji, and how can you say, Krishnaji, you are nothing, you are nothing? And he said, yes. When I said I'm nothing, I meant I'm everything. The smile of a child, the crying woman on a village road, everything. I am everything. So, we can feel the authority in every word uttered by him, the tinge, the streak of authority. But probably there is absolute an ocean of nothingness behind those words. And probably it was because of that authority that the teachings continue to live, continue to survive, and it will continue to do so, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harishji. I think Mr. Ramarao has something to say. Please go ahead, sir.
Sir, my question to Mr. Mark Lee. Sir, I want to raise the question in the context. At the time of the Krishnamurti passed away, that you narrated something like that, something is going, but the body has its own program. I want to have a little bit clarity on that. Kind enough to explain something? Mr. Mark Lee.
Yes. Yes. Well, I was not present when Kay made that statement to Mary Zimbalist, but I was present when Kay said at the end, when he said that he was dying. He knew when he was going to die, but he wasn't going to tell us. That he was not going to, what was the word he used? He didn't say argue with death. He said something like, I've forgotten the exact word, but something, I'm not going to have an argument with death. I'm dying, but I won't tell you when. So there was how can you say it? There was the physical body, which suffered, which was operated on, which took medicines, which was nourished, which was treated. All the things that one would happen for someone who was ill or suffering. And then there was the entity of K that was not the physical. And that's what was speaking. This, when there are several conversations that Kay had at the end when he was racked with pain. He was taking morphine to allow him to speak and to carry on conversations with his friends. And you could see that the physical pain he was suffering was so acute that even the morphine was not able to completely mask it. So the body was suffering, and the entity of K was suffering. There was no separation. But Kay also said at that time that the teacher, he didn't use the word world, he just said the teacher is still here. So was it the teacher who was speaking? Was it the body that was speaking? I don't know.
Can I raise another question, sir?
Please.
So, from this context, may I get some clarity that this physical body is something different and something like which the conscious or something like which is driving on that? Is it different or something like both together working?
Is your question that there is the physical body which contains consciousness and the senses and pain and pleasure, all of that is the physical body, you're asking? And then are you asking, is there something else? Well, Kay has given different answers in different circumstances. On one occasion, he said, there is only the physical. There isn't a separation between the brain and the mind. They are one. There is only the physical with the 7 senses and the physical body. And then on other occasions, he said that the two are separate. They're not the brain and the mind are not one. So I don't know, I'm not an authority in this field. This would be something that you could ask Dr. Krishna. He would know more about this than I.
Professor Krishna, sir, would you like to say something? Unmute, sir. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can make a few comments, not as an authority, but from what I think. I think Krishna Ji said that the mind is outside the brain. but the brain makes inputs into the mind. And it's when the brain stops making inputs into the mind, which means the inputs from the conditioning and the memory, then the mind sees from inside. And that insight is not influenced by the conditioning or the memories. That means you are completely free of the past. Doesn't mean the past ends, but it doesn't dominate your consciousness. These are not his words. This is my interpretation of what I think he was trying to convey to us. For instance, there is the whole element of thinking, which is based on memory, but we also have this capacity for perceiving something which is beyond the known. How does that happen? How does insight take place? And he has said very clearly that he has not thought out his teaching, that it comes to him like a revelation. And so many geniuses have had revelations. There are musicians who have said, I don't compose my music. It flows through me. It's all out there. It flows through me. So that is the mind. That is the realm of consciousness, of pure consciousness, of awareness, which is not part of the brain. It is outside the brain, but the brain makes inputs into it. That's how I understand all this. About authority, it's not that a person like Krishnamurti has no authority. Of course he has, because he has gone very deep into all this and discovered the truths which we have not seen. In that sense, he's an authority. But if you accept what he says, it prevents you from coming upon the truth. The truth is not an idea or a concept, and he can only give us an idea. He cannot give us the truth. We have to come upon the truth for ourselves. That's what he has explained. So it's not that there is no such thing as authority in these matters, but that it is important not to accept things on authority. Because when you accept on authority, you are only accepting a description or an idea, and it prevents you. You accept that as an answer, it prevents your own inquiry into what is true and what is real. So it blocks you from coming upon the truth. That's why he did not deny the masters, but he said it's not important. In your own quest for truth, it is not important what the master has said or what the guru has said, because you should not accept anything on authority. So what that authority says also needs to be investigated, including whatever he says. And he repeatedly said that in all his talks, that, sir, please don't accept what I say, investigate it. He doesn't say that just out of humility, in my opinion. He says that because he really sees that if you accept his words, you only repeat his ideas, what he is conveying, but you have not come upon perception for yourself, and therefore you have not transformed your consciousness. The third comment I have is that it is important in that relationship between Rajgopal and Krishnamurti to remember that the relationship between Rosalind and Rajgopal had ended. Not legally, but morally and physically, it had ended. They had separated, after which the intimacy between Rosalind and Krishnamurti happened. And so there was no element of cheating on a married man, which is the what many people misunderstood when Radha Sloth's book appeared, and therefore they lost their opinion about Krishnamurti. But Krishnaji has never denied sexuality. He has said that sexuality is part of that, and that it can be done with love and it can be done with lust, which is an egoistic thing. And matters is that it is with love and not with lust or with ego. So those are the comments that I want to make about what was said today by Mark. And I want to thank Mark for telling us many things which we did not know about.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We can take 3 more questions. Abhishek Pandey, then Anandji, and then Kanchan Gokte. So Abhishek Pandey, please go ahead.
Sir, my question is that when we read Krishna Ji teachings, everything is crystal and clear. I don't have any problem, no doubt. But when come in this process and dialogues with death and the process and others, that is little bit create problems. So how can we have to look on this? That can we bypass all these things and only focus on teaching? But even Krishna Ji is saying process and all this thing, and so what I hope I can express myself in this way.
Mark, you want to comment on this? Professor Krishna, you want to comment on this, sir?
Well, after Mark. Let's hear Mark.
Okay, Mark,
Yeah,
please.
this is a proverbial complaint and question that Kay seems so clear and simple. The language is he uses ordinary language. His teachings are so simple and so easy to understand. It's when we have a dialogue or we discuss or we debate or we converse about the teachings that we get confused. Well, it seems to me that that's a natural phenomenon because we are using a very, very imperfect and limited tool, our thinking. If we approach the teachings literally, thinking about them, talking about them from our logical intellect, we're going to have problems. We're going to have disagreements and conflicts. So, and Kay has said this on many occasions, you have to approach the teachings differently. You don't approach them with the tool that creates all the problems that you are facing.
My comment about it is that there are these occult powers which the human consciousness is capable of. And some people have these in greater measure than others. And perhaps those who go into this inquiry into self-knowledge and truth come upon certain siddhis which open the doors to those powers. So what I know is that Krishnaji had all those powers which Leadbeater and Annie Besant had. He could see aura, he could read people's minds. And we've just heard from Mark that an astrologer predicted everything about his life accurately without knowing about it. So you can see that there are many things which are beyond logic and beyond reason and beyond the normal senses that we human beings possess. Now, Krishnaji was born with this. He was having visions and so on even before he was taken up by the theosophists. And he used to see his mother and his sister and so on. You can read in the biographies. And I think he had all these occult powers, but he did not give importance to it because cultivating power is not part of the religious mind. Power is ability, including occult power, is ability. And it's not any important thing to have ability. It is more important to have wisdom, which comes from self-knowledge. So Krishnaji never advocated trying to cultivate occult power, though he had it. He encouraged us to come upon self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is that which you obtain through your own perceptions and not through a guru or through a book. It's not knowledge. It is beyond knowledge. It is wisdom. That's how I understand.
Thank you, sir. Anandji, please go ahead and ask your question.
My question is, why do we try to understand K when he himself said he was beyond our understanding? A limited self like me trying to understand someone like K is my question.
Well, sir, it seems to me you made a pretty big assumption that you can't understand and that it's not understandable. I think if you could set those assumptions aside and start to inquire, ask questions, and not work from a predetermined thought, something might happen. Try it.
Thank you, Mark. We can take Kanchan Gogte's question. Kanchan, please go ahead.
Yes, what I want to ask is regarding case studies into academics. We know that he had clearly stated there is no authority of his teachings. His teachings are not to be interpreted, but you can question them, analyze them. Yes, but I think still, and K was not even so much fond of academic studies either. I mean, to pursue any research on his writing, I think so. He did not favor it much. But what is the foundation's view of K and academic studies? Because I think there are so many things that modern academics is talking about: consciousness studies, mind-brain studies, even in COVID times. So I think even academic studies can share some insights. There's a possibility. So what is foundation's view on that?
Well, probably the school would have a view more than a foundation. The position is that academic subjects are important to the extent that they help a child to learn information and to develop some skill or ability that could be useful in their life. It's the way the child, the teacher, weighs academics in terms of is academics the most important aspect of learning? If it isn't, if you define learning in a much broader framework, then you see that academics has only a small part to play in the learning process. And that's where the K schools and any good school that is attempting to do more than simply teach memorization will work to help a child to develop their ability to learn. And it's learning beyond content, learning beyond subject matter. It's learning for itself, learning per se. I asked Kay once about whether Krishnamurti should be taught as an academic subject in colleges. This was in 1985. I had just gone on a tour of colleges that were teaching Krishnamurti. And Kay was a subject in the university. And there were 6 or 8 universities across the US that had courses called The Teachings of J. Krishnamurti, or Krishnamurti and Buddhism, or he was an academic subject. And Kay's reply to me when I asked him was, yes, perhaps they will have an insight. Perhaps they will learn something. So he didn't close the door to the academic approach.
Thank you, Mark. I think we can take the last question. Clemis has something to say, and then we can close. Clemis, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank Mark Lee for this wonderful session. And I already feel that we have taken so much of his time, and I don't want to take much. But I really would like to ask him, I read all your books, and I cannot even say how much I feel grateful for these books, you know, especially this, the 2 last ones, that the World Teacher and the Teachings and Life of Krishnamurti and the Process. So it brings to light so many things that otherwise would be very difficult for us to have access to it. So what I would like to ask you, if possible, if you can give an advice for us who are studying Krishnamurti, and because you have been with him for so long and you have witnessed so many things that most of us don't have the opportunity. So do you have any advice for us who are studying how to study and how to approach the teachings? So that's my question for you. Thank you.
That's a dangerous question, because you asked for me to voice an opinion. But I have one, and I will give it to you without shame. And that is, I think, you know, there are over 300 Krishnamurti books, and there are biographies and memoirs and full talk compilations and excerpt compilations and every possible variety of book and video tapes and audio tapes. And I know people who are studying everything. They read every book. They listen to every tape. They pore over all 300 of these books. And I think that if you asked me for advice, I would say, pick one book or one talk and just read that, but read it seriously. Read it thoroughly. Listen to yourself as you read it. Watch yourself as you read it. Having a huge knowledge of Krishnamurti doesn't help. Taking seriously one thing that Krishnamurti has said does. And I think that students of the teachings would best limit themselves to one talk or one book. That's my advice, and I apologize for giving advice.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you
announce
and
one
meeting
thing.
you.
Sir,
Uh,
Professor,
that's
please let me allow to ask one question to Sir Lee, sir. Mark Lee, we are fixing your lecture on 28th March. No, sir, he has agreed bi-monthly. So
Okay.
I am asking him, 28th March will do.
Yes.
Sir, with all respect, I don't give lectures.
Yeah, no, I am not saying. I am
I
not
don't give
saying.
talks.
Yeah, this is the dialogue sort of. What people wanted to know it because 67, 69 or 70% are there. Just to be kind to give time on 28th March. And subject will be as per your own choice. Dubey sir will coordinate that. Professor Krishna will be there.
We'll arrange something, Mark. Maybe there will be a dialogue with you and Dr. Gajanan Rao and Professor Krishna. Something of that kind can be organized.
Keep me informed.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank
Can
you.
we consider it 28th March fixed?
Paka.
Yeah. Pakka.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Okay.
Very
Thank
kind
you.
of you. Or please make announcement for the next Sunday.
Yeah, next Sunday also we'll have our talks at 9:30, and we have Dr. David Moody, who is also associated with Oak Grove School. So he'll be talking to us. So may I request all of you to please join us 9:30 a.m. next Sunday, that is 24th. Thank you so
Moody.
much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dubey sir.
Thank
And
you.
special request to
thank you.
Gajanan Rao and Professor Krishna. Please take a note of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
to-
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for all participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.